Let's now get to work by creating our style sheet inside the sidebar. So new file alongside our index.html, which I'm going to call the styles.css. Close this down, and we can also link this up in our index inside of our head section. So create the link with the href of styles.css. So let's start with the HTML inside of our style sheet. And inside of here, we're going to introduce our font size. And I'm going to set mine to be 10 pixels. And also a default font weight. And I'm going to use 300. So just before we go ahead and create the rest of our styles for this project, I'm going to introduce something which may save a bit of time. So this is going to be a plugin called Live Server. And this is going to save us refreshing the browser each time we make any changes. So we can make changes in our code, save the file, and this will instantly update. This is completely optional. You don't need to install this plugin. And if you're using a different text editor, you may not have the same one available. And to introduce this, we need to go over to the sidebar. If you're using Visual Studio Code, click on the extensions and then use the search at the very top. If you do a search for the live server, and then inside here, you may have multiple options. The one I'm currently using is this one just here, and then you will need to install and enable. Once this is enabled, you should see a button down at the bottom which says Go Live. You can then click on this to start up a live server, and this will then open this up inside the browser. If you don't see this icon at the very bottom, you can go to View, Command Palette, and then do a search for Live Server, where we'll have the option to open this up with our live server. So this is completely optional, and you can continue with the same way we've been using previously. But now if we go into our next selector, which is the body, and we can set some properties inside of here. Let's set the width of our body to be 90% of the viewport. We can center this with margin 0 auto. And then I'm going to set a background, which will be a radial gradient. We're going to use this to blend between two different colors. This is going to blend in a circular motion from the center right out to the end of the page. So the radial gradient is going to take in two values. The first one, I'm going to use 34, 3e, 63, and then separated by a comma. The second one is going to be 2a, 3352. Give this a save, and we'll instantly see the changes inside the browser. After this, let's go for our main section, which is the wrapper for all of our game. So we can create a wrapper which is going to set the text alignment to be in the center, the background color, F8, F1, E9. The border which is going to wrap our game on the left, the bottom, and also the right. So first of all, we need to set the border color and also set this to be a solid line. We can then set this to go on 3 different sides. So our border is going to be a solid line and a color which is going to be equal to EF 7B 54. If we save this, currently we see the border is placed on all 4 sides. To select this on multiple sides, we can use the border width property and then enter the width we want the border on 4 different sides. So the first one is the top. We want 0 on the top, 8 pixels on the right, 8 pixels on the bottom, and also for the left too. Let's make this section a little taller with the minimum height of 80% of the viewport height. We can also round these borders on the bottom, left and right with our border radius. So the top left and the top right is 0, and then 3 rems on the bottom right and also the bottom left. Also 1 rem of padding to give it some spacing inside of this section. The text color, the value I'm going to use is going to be 1F2933. So this is our main section, and now we're going to target some of the elements which are nested inside. Starting up at the very top of our welcome screen, we have this level 2 heading, and then we can also select our text elements too. So first of all, let's go for our H2, and we can set the font size to be a little larger, so 2.2 rems. And also we can create some spacing on the top and bottom. So I'm going to give this quite a bit of spacing on the top and bottom, and then 0 on the left and right. Then our text, which is inside the P elements. And we can also increase the font size to be 1.8 rems. Sticking with this welcome screen section. Next up we have this button area, which has the class of button wrapper. Currently these two buttons are placed side by side, so we can change this by setting the display type to be flex, the flex direction to be column. Next we can target the individual buttons with the button element. Let's remove the default border with none. We can also set the cursor to be a pointer once the user hovers over this button. Then the background color for our buttons. So let's go for hex value. This is going to be a green color with the shade of 83E1 D0. So I'm padding on the inside of the button of 2 rems. Then we're going to apply some border radius on the top of our first button and then the bottom of our second button. This is going to give us this rounded effect we see on the buttons just here. So for now we'll target the very first button inside of this selector. So we can set the border radius on the top. So 1 rem on the top left, 1 rem on the top right, and then 0 on the bottom. Currently this is going to apply to all of our buttons. So now we can override this by selecting the last child. Last child is going to target the last of our type of buttons, which is inside of this wrapper. So if we had a third button, that would target the third button. If we had a fourth button, that would target the fourth one, and so on. We only have our 2 buttons, so last child is going to apply to this hard button just here. We can override the background, and I'm going to make use of the same red color which we have for this border. We'll also use the same red color for our range slider during the game too. So this means we are now using a same color multiple times. We could go ahead and include the same color, but we can also use something which is called Css Variables, also known as Custom Properties. Just like when using JavaScript, we can use Css Custom Properties to create a variable and use this multiple times inside of our file. So the way we can do this, if we go to the very top, I'm going to create a section which is going to contain all of our variables. The first thing we generally do is to target the root. This is going to allow us to create our variables which we can use across our whole page. The way we create a variable inside of CSS is by using the double dashes. We then use a variable name such as green, and then we can select our value. So the green value which we are currently using is this one just here for our buttons. So we can copy this, paste this in and add a semicolon. We can also declare our red color, which we are going to reuse, which has a value of EF7B54. Next, we can also set the color for our background, so dash dash background, and this is going to be the color for our main section. So the main section, if we scroll down, was this one just here. We can grab this and set this as a variable. And if we wanted to, we could also set the colors for our radial gradient. So let's copy these. So gradient 1. And also the gradient 2. So now we have our variables declared up at the very top. How do we now use these in our project? Well, we use them in place of our colors. So let's remove the first radial gradient. We then set these inside of a var function, and then we declare the name which we gave it just above. So this one was gradient 1, and then the second value is going to be gradient 2. Again, inside of our var function. Save this, and now our gradient now being reinstated. Down to the main section, we can replace our background, also with our variable. The border. We also have this stored inside of a variable, and this one is called red. This still works fine inside the browser. So now if we scroll down to our buttons, we have the green variable, so dash dash green, and the background color for our last child or our second button is going to be the red variable, which we also set just above. The border radius for this is going to be different too. So we can override this with the border radius by setting the top to be 0 and 0, and then the bottom right and also the bottom left to be equal to 1 rem. We also have the new game button just here, but we'll hide this with JavaScript very soon. So now down to the game section, let's go for our level 3 heading, which is the text of your guess. This will also be replaced later on to be a message to the user. So all we're going to do for our level 3 heading is to set the font size to be 2 rems. Next we have our number input. This is the only input which we have on the screen, so we don't need to be more specific about selecting the type. All we're going to do is to set the border to be 1 pixel, a solid line which is going to be light grey. We'll make it blend in with the rest of the background by setting this to be transparent. Some margin to give it some spacing outside of our element of 2 rems on the top and bottom, and then 0 on the left and right. Some padding for some internal spacing of 1 rem. This is the top and bottom, and then 0 on the left and right. The width, 16 rems. And then we can also set the text align to be in the center. This is going to be the text which the user enters inside of this field. And this will push this into the center of our element. Below this we have our range section, which is the wrapper down at the bottom here, which contains our 3 spans. So we're not going to do a lot with these span elements in the CSS. We'll leave these until the JavaScript section later on. But for now though, we can set the range section to have a certain height and also the background color. So this was an ID. The display type is going to be the Flexbox. So these will appear across the page in a row by default. The background, to begin, this will be a full green color, so we can make use of our green variable. A height of 50 pixels, a padding value of 0, and then also some margin. So I'm just going to set the margin to be 0 on the top and right, 4 rems on the very bottom, and 0 on the left. This is just to give us some bottom margin to space this from the stats section just below. Next, we're going to make the text of 1 to 100 a little larger. And this section has the ID, which is going to be range output. So the font size, 1.6 rems. And this is all we currently need to do for this range section. We'll do the rest over in our JavaScript. Down below this we have our stats section, and this has the class of stats. This is for our wrapper, and all we're going to do inside of here is to set the text align to be on the left, and then we can take care of our 2 sections inside. Inside of our index.html, we gave both of these sections a class of info. This is so we can make use of the CSS Flexbox, just like on the final version, where we'll place both of these items alongside each other. We'll add some spacing in between and make sure these are aligned across the page. So our info, the display type of flex. We can then use justify content to add the space between. And currently these are not lined up correctly across the page. We see that this is a little higher. So to fix this, we'll align our items on the cross axes into the center. Both this value of 0 and also the dash were contained inside of these span elements. So to fix this, we can target our info section and then any span which is inside. So the font size, I'm going to go for 1.6 rems. So we're almost done for our styling for this project. Just before we finish off, let's target this button just here, which is going to only appear at the end of the game. This has the ID of new game button. And all we're going to do is to reset the border radius to be 0. And then finally, we can add a media query for the larger sizes. So at media, the minimum screen width of 800 pixels. And the only thing I'm going to do here is to restrict the body width when this gets larger. So on the larger screens, I'm just going to set the maximum width to be 60% of the viewport width, just so it doesn't look too overstretched. So the body section, we can set the width to be 60 VW. And that's it now for our styling. You can of course change things if you want to, but next we're going to move on to our JavaScript section and begin to handle the functionality for our game.